Hello, it's Scott Manley here, back with another batch of questions from my supporters over at Patreon. And we're going to get right into, Axel S-Bomb asking, what is the state of the art in radiation shielding for deep space missions? Thinking about missions to the Gateway and the Moon, as well as transits to and from Mars, and presuming you're talking about radiation shielding for people, because of course radiation shielding for electronics and other hardware is also important. But yes, saying state of the art implies that there's radical improvements that can be made. And yes, there are technological concepts for like active radiation protection using magnetic fields that steer ionized particles away. Really, the thing that we mostly spend time on is looking at putting material between the people and the radiation, because just having the radiation come in and have to plow through, either propellant tanks or dedicated radiation shielding, or even the poop of the astronauts. Yes, you can actually encase, you can use poop as shielding. And obviously you can also use the food as shielding. If you think about radiation shielding on Earth, we tend to use heavy materials like concrete and lead, well actually concrete with lead in it. And whereas on space, we actually tend to use lighter materials like polythene. Polyethylene is actually one of the most well-tested and well-studied materials for blocking radiation in space. And part of the reason why we do one thing versus the other is the type of radiation we deal with on Earth is mostly things like neutrons and gamma rays. Like, sure, there's alpha particles and beta particles, but those tend to get they tend to get dealt with by the atmosphere. It's those last two are the penetrating ones. And those are the reason why you have these vests and or radiation shields or whatever that are lead, because you want to block them in as short a distance as possible. And actually, it turns out that blocking neutrons and blocking gamma rays and stuff, lead does a pretty good job because it puts a lot of electrons into a very small volume, and it's the electrons which cause the gamma rays to scatter. For space, there's two types of radiation in space. There's, first of all, radiation from the sun in the form of protons, which are mainly protons. There's some other stuff. And there's some X-rays. And then there's cosmic rays, which come in. Those are even higher energy. And those are mainly protons, alpha particles, and maybe some electrons. So these come in from outside the solar system. And actually, the best way to shield against cosmic rays in space is the sun. The sun's magnetic field actually protects the whole solar system from high energy cosmic rays. And when the sun is really active, it actually reduces the amount of cosmic rays, albeit you increase the amount of solar proton radiation. So I think I saw one study that basically said the best time to go to Mars is during solar maximum, because that minimizes your amount of cosmic rays, which are super high energy and go through anything, and instead leaves you with high energy protons from the sun, and those are much easier to shield against using hydrogen-rich protection scattering systems. And the other reason why hydrogen-rich systems work better than, say, lead is when you get up to the very large nuclei and you have these particles coming in, they can hit the nuclei and they spallate, they generate more secondary radiation. So when you have just protons, like hydrogen, that there tends to be a lot less of that. So I think one source said that for a reliable mission, you would need something like 10 centimeters of aluminium over like some protected part of the ship where they could wait out a solar storm. And then it would be super manageable. But really, it does come down to managing this and deciding what you can accept and minimizing the time where you're exposed to a lot of material. So that's a fairly long answer to start with. And yes, next question, Stephen Schmidt. Thinking about how important Jupiter is to our solar system, would it be possible to send some kind of long-term manned research mission there, or are the radiation and electromagnetic hazards of fields too strong for human survival near Jupiter? What other problems would get in the way of this kind of mission? Well, the main problem that would get in the way is it's a really long way. You would have to go out there and spend a very long time out that way. So there's a painting I remember, or piece of space art that shows a person painting Jupiter from the surface of Io with volcanoes in the background. That is never going to happen because there's way too much radiation Basically, the closer you get to Jupiter, the more radiation you get from that's trapped in Jupiter's magnetic field. The Jovian equivalent of Van Allen belts. And yeah, I think Io, Europa, and Ganymede, they all have pretty much too high levels of radiation for you to spend a lot of time on the surface. Callisto, on the other hand, it actually seems to be much more manageable if you look at the numbers. So yeah, if you wanted to mount a mission to Callisto, it wouldn't be too hard. Callisto probably has a fair amount of water ice and very likely has liquid water in places, just not as much as, say, Europa. Now, of course, if you're wanting to avoid these radiation effects, you can go under the surface, and that really helps you a whole lot. Not going to happen in Io because nobody likes swimming in, molten lava. Europa, you could actually, in theory, go scuba diving underneath that ice. It's really, really thick, but the the gravity of Europa is low enough that it's at the high end of what is possible in scuba with highly technical gear. But yeah, Callisto is a good target as far as I'm concerned for a human mission, but it is a very long time in space. Zach Strong. Hi, Scott. A couple of friends and I are working on a universe building project and we thought it would help with an issue we had a hard time researching. Could a planet be shielded from a neutron star's radiation? God, we're all about radiation questions today, aren't we? I love it. If it was orbiting a yellow-blue similar star, what would the sky look like from the planet's surface in either case? Well, first of all, it would depend on how far away you were from the neutron star. So neutron stars have masses of greater than 1.4 solar masses, because that's the Chandrasekhar mass limit. There's a Chandrasekhar limit and a Chandrasekhar mass, and they mean different things, and I always forget which one's which. But yeah, neutron stars are remnants from stars. So you've had a star that formed, it went through its main sequence, became a red giant, has a core collapse supernova, and you're left with a neutron star. So whatever that planet is, that is orbiting another star in this star system. That means probably that the neutron star has to be a certain distance out, right? So it can't be too close. It can't be like a neutron star orbiting at the distance of Jupiter. I don't think that would work from a stability point of view. Now, you say yellow-blue similar star, wouldn't be a blue star, because if it were a blue stars are high mass and they evolve too quickly. You want a yellow or even a red star that will outlive the star that caused the supernova that left the neutron star behind. Could that protect the planet? That's a very good question. Again, I would have to do the math on that, but I think the dynamic constraints that basically says it has to survive the initial instability of you basically got one heavy mass star and then it becomes a lower mass star after the supernova, and yet this has to remain bound the whole time. That probably puts constraints on how close they can be. You might actually have it in a fairly eccentric orbit, depending upon the age. See, I've got to think about that. Look, it would be a pretty fabulous thing. And the other thing about neutron stars is that when we think about pulsars, we think about this magnetic field sweeping out and blowing out radiation. And they tend to be fairly collimated. So you could design a neutron star which is preferentially throwing, it has its magnetic fields pointed away and it's not aiming at that planet. Or for story, you could have something where most of the radiation goes out in a plane, and there's times in this planet's life where it passes through these radiation belts and there's terrible storms and things like that. Boy, it's there's a lot of places you could go with this story. But yeah, the neutron star would be probably generating interesting aurora. And truthfully, yeah, it's whatever the story needs, I'm sure you could spend some time and come up with it. That's what I'm going to say. But you could definitely make a livable planet in that. But I would think a little about your orbit. Okay, Seb, would you rather fly New Shepard or ride passenger in an FA-18 for 30 minutes? As much as I love the F-18 and stuff, I think New Shepard is currently where I'd be at, for the simple reason that I would be a passenger in either case and I prefer to go higher and see more. Whereas I know it's actually possible to buy rides in the back of fighter jets like MiGs or whatever. So that would be more affordable. So yeah, just from a simple economic argument, I would go with New Shepard. But yeah, realistically, half-hour flight in a fighter jet is also more likely to make me sick. You'd need a little bit of training to work up to it. Who knows? Alan thought of another one, which means must have asked me a question previously. You've talked about advanced Gemini, but what about big Gemini, or Gemini, as NASA would say, and reports that was being considered as a lower cost replacement for the space shuttle? So here's the thing. So basically, big Gemini was proposed by McDonnell Douglas, I don't know, sometime in the 60s. And they basically, so there was Gemini, and then there was the Air Force's Blue Gemini with the manned orbiting laboratory, where they would have like a big space station attached underneath the heat shield of the Gemini. And they would actually have a hatch in the heat shield, and they would go in and they would have all these cameras to observe the ground, right? That's what the military was thinking. Before, I think they were just wanting to have people fly in space because obviously Corona was doing a pretty good job. So Big Gemini was like, let's scale this up even more. Let's have the basic Gemini capsule, and then like there's a row of seats behind it. I think they could fit something like a dozen people in this, and then potentially a cargo bay behind that. And this was something that was proposed like as a next step after Apollo, which is interesting because, of course, Apollo was a more advanced capsule. The thing about the Gemini, Big Gemini, was that also it would land under a Rogallo wing, so it would fly horizontally under a big soft parachute type wing. And I know that some people at NASA thought it was a good idea because they thought that shuttle would take too long. They wanted to have a space station with a dozen people in the early 1970s, and they didn't think shuttle would be ready until too late. So this was a sort of a smaller, easier, more likely to happen project. But ultimately, of course, it never happened because funding got cut at NASA, right? The politicians were really interested in not paying for this and instead paying for the Vietnam War and other things like that. It could have made sense if things had lined up, but equally the space shuttle could have also made more sense, let's say. Scott F. Hey Scott, great name by the way. Please explain how an object falling into a black hole event horizon would appear to slow down and freeze on the surface as viewed from an outside observer due to time dilation. Wouldn't that mean that every object that ever fell into an event horizon would be recorded as a frozen image on the surface? Oh my god. Okay, so here's the thing. These visions of a black hole with the event horizon and the timelines never actually touching the event horizon as viewed by an outside observer, like this is something that basically, it's sort of, when you think about it initially, it's like, oh, that's kind of mind-blowing. And then the more you think about it, it becomes amazingly mind-blowing, right? So it turns out, if you do the math, there's no point outside of a black hole where the event horizon is in the past. So there's actually no way to actually see the event horizon. That means you can never see the formation of the black hole, right? Everything ultimately ends up in this hypothetical surface. But yeah, the event horizon around a Schwarzschild like metric black hole, it's an approximation. It is a very accurate approximation that happens to match everything. But if you imagine an object falling down from the outside observer, it does appear to like slow down and stop above the event horizon. But also, it becomes redshifted very rapidly, so you can't see it anymore. And also because if you imagine the object comes in, you would think, well, wait a second, you've got the black hole here and you've got this tiny mass here. Doesn't this mean you've got like some sort of binary, non-spherical mass? And yes, except that it very quickly becomes spherical as it approaches the event horizon. So then that is from an outside observer. So you can't see it that way. The charge, if you imagine an electric charge coming down and coming close, well, it turns out that electric charges, they communicate their charge via photon exchange, right? Electromagnetic forces are mediated by photon exchange, and those get distorted. So an electric charge comes down close to the event horizon. It doesn't look like it's next to the event horizon because of the distortion. It looks like it's at the center of the black hole. So it all sort of fits together and makes sense. What I'm basically saying is that these models that we use are really approximations. If you're part of the black hole, it's there's not necessarily a time that you are observed to be inside. I don't know. It's very complicated. Basically, as far as you're concerned outside, you're never going to see it because the things get time dilated. Any non-sphericity is very quickly eliminated by changes to the geometry. Yeah. I'm going to get comments from people that actually understand this saying, "What are you talking about, Scott?" Okay. Hi, Scott. Hope you're well. Why don't rocket companies have a wider range of fairing sizes? I quite often see a really small satellite in a big fairing. And mostly because it takes a lot of testing to validate fairings with the aerodynamics and loads. And if you build a bigger fairing, that moves the center of mass, the center of drag forwards, and therefore the center of mass backwards. And if you took a Falcon 9 and had to make a smaller fairing, well, that means now you've got two sections in the factory for two different fairing sizes. It makes more sense to just make one type of fairing. There are some really interesting fairing designs for sure. There's like the lenticular fairing design the idea was you would fly up a huge circular mirror, disc-shaped mirror in a fairing that was side on. There was also the large asymmetric fairing, which sort of looked like a head of an arrow, and they wanted to put certain large payloads. They advertised this. They said they'd done the math on it, and if there was a customer that wanted it, they could fly it. Never happened. It would fly on an Atlas Heavy, which is something that never actually happened. Atlas V Heavy, which we would have 3 cores of the Atlas V. It basically comes down to the fact that building the fairings and approving the fairings is hard, and the more production lines you have, the more factory space you're taking for these things, right? If you're having to do just one thing, it's going to cost much more than doing the other big thing that you've already got a production line for. Paul Brundit. For years, manned spaceplane concepts have come and gone, but with the exception of the space shuttle, none have come to reality. We now have several different capsules, but no Dinosaur, Hermes, manned Dream Chaser, X-37C. Are spaceplanes just too hard to develop, and do they offer no advantage over a capsule? They are hard to develop. The geometry on a spaceplane is much more complicated, and you inevitably end up with sharper corners, like along the leading wing edges, which means much higher thermal loads. That means you need a heat shield which is not homogeneous, right? It means that your whatever thermal protection system, if you've got tiles, means much more geometry. It does make everything a lot more complicated, and a capsule is much simpler geometry. Also, because you have to have the wings, you inevitably get a worse surface area to volume ratio, so you get less space inside it for the same mass. Of course, there are advantages to capsules, right? They have much better cross-range capability, lower G-loading for the cargo and or passengers. And the nice thing is, the thing that Dream Chaser really wants to offer is the ability to land at an airfield and pretty much have the stuff offloaded right away. Whereas if you look at the Dragon cargo, it lands at sea, gets recovered, sails back, and then the stuff gets offloaded. So there's a sort of prompt recovery of cargo advantage that Dream Chaser is supposed to offer. But yeah, it's that a capsule is a much safer bet and is much easier to develop, and you get much better volume for the same amount of mass, and that's why they're kind of popular. It's very rare that they need the advantages that space planes offer. Okay, finally, Joe. So we know Starship flight plan requires refueling in space to go to Mars. After the Starship's final burn, to get on the correct trajectory, there should be still some fuel in the tanks to do a landing burn on Mars. Will this fuel help keep the rocket cool as it enters the atmosphere? I would imagine all the cryogenic fuel would slam up against the side of the rocket as it slows down. So, So you're sort of right there. Yes, absolutely. This propellant would slosh up against the side of the tanks and keep it cool. But the Starship can't rely on that. First of all, there's no propellant in the front section in the cargo, so that's not going to help it. Secondly, if you're returning from Mars to Earth, then you have much less propellant in the tanks. You only have enough propellant in those tanks to fill the headers, the oxygen and the fuel, oxidizer and fuel header tanks. And those are in the middle of the rocket, far away from the edges. So you absolutely have to rely on the heat shield. Right? Coming back from Mars to Earth, by the way, is going to be much hotter than arriving at Mars, I believe. I think the velocities are going to be significantly higher, and you've got less, more gravity, less. Anyway, the point is, yeah, you cannot rely on that at all. It's a nice thing to have, but if you're getting to the situation where it makes a difference, then you have lost heat shield tiles, and you shouldn't ever be in that situation because you're not going to be able to guarantee it in many conditions. Okay, I think that's a pretty good episode. I hope you enjoyed all that. Remember, check out the Patreon if you want to ask questions. I've got a huge backlog, and hopefully some of these questions hopefully some of these have answered the questions that were burning in your head. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.